Hello, students. This is Mr. Gore, and this is part two of the Rome recorded lecture coming from chapter 6 of your History of World Societies textbook if you're one of my SAU students. And so I ended part 1 talking about slavery and women in Roman society. So I just want to recap that before we move on to the Roman civil wars. So there was a lot of slavery in Rome. Roman Empire and so forth at this time. At one point, a third of the empire was made up of slaves. And so how they acquired these slaves were they would capture them from territorial expansion. That's one of the ways that really the main way how Rome gained new wealth is they would acquire new territory. There was also certain slaves like Greek slaves that were purchased there would be these educated tutors for Roman families, kids, and so forth, because they really kind of in some ways had a crush on Greek culture. They adopted a lot of the Greek gods and kind of gave them Roman names to a certain extent and made them part of the Roman pantheon of gods and so forth to revere. And they really admired kind of Greek culture, and they used to call the Greco-Roman world. They were kind of referred to anybody that wasn't Greek or Roman as barbarians. That's where the term came from. So slaves were not associated with race. A lot of times slaves were initiated into the family religion. Some were freed, some could work their way to freedom. It wasn't viewed as like chattel slavery is later in world history, where slaves are viewed as like head of cattle and so forth. But like I said previously in the part 1, slaves were oftentimes very mistreated, working in farm work, mining work, oftentimes raped, women and boys, both young boys and teenage boys and so forth. And I was that everywhere, no, but there's evidence of that happening and not having legal repercussions. Women could not be citizens. They didn't have any voting power. They did lose property rights once they were married. Upper class women had a little bit better role, and by the end of the Roman Empire, Roman women were almost equal to men at settings. That's probably I don't have really evidence to show this, but probably influence of Christianity, which elevated the status of women by this point. But women could inherit property and so forth. Once they married, their property went to their husbands and so forth. Now let's get into the Roman civil wars. So what you end up having is the century before, where you go from BCE to CE, Rome transitioned from a republic to eventually a empire time. And so as Rome experienced more and more military successes, many soldiers and armies had more loyalty to their general than to Rome, such as Gaius Marius, Lucius Pompey, Magnus, and Julius Caesar, one of the most famous Roman commanders of all time. He's arguably one of the greatest military minds of all time. Clashes between vying groups of Romans thus became civil wars in which generals opposed one another for leadership of the state. And so at one point, there are 3 consuls of Rome. You have Julius Caesar, Pompey, and a guy named Crassus. Crassus was probably one of the wealthiest guys in the entire empire, very influential politician. He had taken his legions and tried to conquer Parthia, kind of Rome's arch nemesis to the east, the second Persian dynasty. So you had the Achaemenid dynasty, the Parthians, and later the Sassanids. So the Parthians were the second one, and Crassus is defeated. His expansion is stopped, and he is actually captured and killed. And so that happens as a result of his attack on Parthia. And what you end up seeing is Pompey and Julius Caesar end up fighting a civil war over power. Julius Caesar ends up prevailing and defeating Pompey. Pompey is the one who captured Israel and some other areas. It was kind of interesting. He had gone into the Jewish temple and into the Holy of Holies and looked around and walked right back out. Now, Caesar made a name for himself by winning victories in Gaul. He had crossed the Rhine River and explored into Germany and then came back. It's crazy as they built this incredible bridge across the Rhine River within about a week's time. It's still a mystery how the Roman soldiers did this in such a quick time. Explored for a couple of weeks and then turned around and came back and then destroyed the bridge. Kind of crazy. Now, Caesar ended up defeating Pompey, enacting some reforms. He ended up having a relationship with Cleopatra, who was the last Ptolemy ruler in Egypt, which was a descendant of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. and she ends up taking her own life when her and Mark Antony were defeated by Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. Now, Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE by some senators who were conspirators. And so what ends up happening is Octavian, his grandnephew, and Mark Antony, who was one of Julius Caesar's right-hand men, their civil war kind of led to the downfall officially of the Republic when Augustus ends up winning over a lot of the legion's loyalty. He defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Greece. Mark Antony takes his own life, and so does Cleopatra, and then he ends up becoming really the first true Caesar, so to speak. Now, and that happened in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium. So let's look at the Roman Empire's time. Okay, and so talked about that. Here is a bust of Pompey. Here's Julius Caesar, the man, the myth, the legend. This is the painting of the famous Ides of March, if you ever read William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. All right, so this is what historians call Pax Romana from 27 BCE to about 193 CE. This is Rome at its highest extent, okay? And so you can see right here on the map and so forth. And it's an interesting time because this is going to be a time where Christianity widely spreads throughout Europe and North Africa and other parts of the Middle East, even heads far east into Central Asia. We don't know because of lack of written record how far it truly spreads. Now, Octavian's goals was to strengthen family values, keep the peace, and promote prosperity. The result was a successful, well-governed empire that extended through the Mediterranean. The next 200 years became known as Pax Romana, or Roman peacetime, although it certainly wasn't peaceful because they were always expanding their borders, it seemed like, and fighting Parthia or fighting the Germanic tribes, or had finally captured all of Spain and are capturing into the Balkan regions and Romania and places like that, Western Hungary. But in the sense that there's not these nasty civil wars as much. Rome built a network of roads that made movement of trade, goods, written orders, and soldiers and their provisions a whole lot easier. And they created one of the greatest road systems of all time. And it's still there. Now, granted, they built modern roads around it. But in addition, Rome built fortresses and walls to protect strategic cities and transportation points. They built Hadrian's Wall in the British Isles to keep out the Celts, and which is kind of interesting. And there is a statue of Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. Okay, this was this on the bottom right was a prominent upper class woman's hairstyle. It took a lot of work. These are Roman coins, and they ended up as far east as Vietnam. Rome was really known for its glass. That was a luxury good that was very much traded on the Silk Road to the east, and ended up trading on the Indian Ocean trade, and particularly traded in the Mediterranean Sea trade. The trans-Saharan trade does begin at the end of period 2, which is 600 BC to 600 CE. They traded with the Roman Empire in North Africa to West Africa. It becomes much more prevalent in period 3, which is 600 CE to 1450 CE. Here's what a Roman road would have looked like. You'd had sand at the bottom to catch the water, because sand always goes to the lowest lying area. Stone or slab and cement, then crushed stone and cement, and then you put stone blocks on top. You always had drainage ditches. It was really cool because think about interstate highway system. It's designed to drain away from the road, and it's designed to be a gentle slope to do that. And really, Rome kind of developed that, and so forth. And so the old saying, all roads lead to Rome within the Roman Empire, that was correct, but also all roads led outside of Rome to other parts of the empire. Okay, this is the Appian Way. You see it today as one of the Roman roads, those big stone blocks. And that is at its height, the Roman road. So it really facilitates overseas and even Mediterranean sea trade, trade with the Black Sea and so forth, because of its incredible road network. It was easier to transport goods, easier to transport soldiers, easier to transport information. And this is the trade routes that Christianity spreads on. And so we're going to talk about in the next lecture about the spread of Buddhism in East Asia, and it spreads on the Silk Road. Even though the Silk Road is not a physical road, it's different trails. That happens as a result of this. So Now let's look at social classes. The social system was basically the same as the Republic time period, but people could move up economically. And so merchants were highly valued. A new equestrian class was available to male Roman citizens whose property was valued about 400,000 sesterces. Equestrians could hold positions of authority in government, but not ones as influential as those occupied by senators and their families. The senatorial class became the instrument of Augustus and later rulers by which they directed the affairs of the empire. Now, what's a difference between the Han dynasty in China at this time? Granted, the vast majority of those that were civil service people were not from the lower classes, but at least with the civil service exams, if a village had a really gifted poor person, very smart, they could provide them education, and they have a chance at advancing themselves with the scholar bureaucrat system. In Rome, you don't really have that. No person born into lower class could ever hope to become a position of government unless they rose to the ranks of the military, became a general, and seized power that way. Now, Augustus and his successors made clear that their will was absolute. Augustus offered a tax bonus to members of his class who had more than 2 children because he wished to see the numbers of the aristocracy increase. Lower classes no longer were able to represent in their popular assemblies. They were nevertheless pacified by free games and grain, and the possibility, however, unlikely advancing in social order. Oftentimes, emperors would give away free wine, free olive oil, free grains to lower classes to appease them. And with gladiatorial games, and particularly chariot races are actually a bigger deal and more popular, even gladiatorial games. But because of movies, we think of gladiatorial games. But these chariot racers were Roman celebrities at the time. Slavery continued to increase as both businesses and large estates increased. Greek slaves, as I mentioned previously, were in high demand as physicians and teachers, maintaining the continuity of Greek culture. It's kind of, today we wouldn't think of a slave being a doctor, but that was what you actually had with the Greeks. Slaves could sometimes buy their freedom. Okay. Now, women at this time, okay, during the Empire time, so going from the Republic, which they had very little rights, to the Empire time, rights of women expanded. For example, women could divorce, never was possible in the time of the Republic. Many upper class women did so in the tumultuous times preceding the takeover by Augustus. They also began to exercise more property rights as new inheritance laws allowed them to gain and keep control of property. Where in the Republic time period, if they got married, they lost their property rights. And then in the Empire time period, then that was not the case. Typical of their increasing influence was their presence as near equals in social events, something made clear by the art and literature of the period. Even without political rights, the economic worth of women who ran businesses gave them some political influence. Roman women had more influence than women in India, China, or the Hellenistic world. That's one key difference for this time period. Right. And this kind of shows you the principalities of Rome at this time. You had provincial governors and so forth. And later, when the Roman Empire splits between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, here's what it looked like. And this is the greatest extent of the Roman Empire in 14 CE. There's time Parthia is going to take territory from them over here in the east. And there's time they'll lose territory up here in the north and so forth, particularly when the Germanic tribes start coming in as the Huns come across this area and start pushing the German tribes into the Roman territory. Okay. Now, Roman law continued to spread to all parts of the empire. With literature and philosophy and so forth. Virgil, Horace, and Ovid were famous Roman writers and poets. Historians such as Livy and Tacitus carried on the tradition of Roman literature in the 1st century CE. Philosophers such as Seneca did as well. Roman writers were heavily influenced by Greek traditions. Epicureanism was a Greek-influenced philosophy in Rome and promoted living simply, enjoying the pleasures of life, and not focusing on appealing to the gods. Now, political institutions. They were, you had provincial governors. And as I showed you from those maps, you had Rome divided up into kind of provinces, kind of like you would see under the Persian Empire with the satraps and so forth. Armies were very well organized. And at times, generals gained more popularity and were more powerful than emperors. And at times, generals were going to overthrow emperors later after the Pax Romana. But Rome did have a series of laws, and you could purchase your citizenship. And rights of citizens prevented you, even if you were accused of the worst crime, from ever being crucified. And that was the worst form of Roman death penalty punishment. And so forth. Like Paul of Tarsus, who helped spread Christianity, he purchased his Roman citizenship, and that gave him a legal right to eventually appeal to Caesar. And that's why he got to go to Rome and be before the Caesar, and eventually he gets executed by Emperor Nero. But that happens with the privilege of Roman citizenship. And so it was expensive to become a Roman citizen if you were not born a Roman citizen, but it was something that could be attained if you were an adult male. All right, let's look at Roman religion. I took a class in graduate school on the religion of the Roman Empire. There's a lot of cults that develop at this time, but really a lot of things are polytheistic and so forth. And then we'll talk about Christianity. Syncretism played a key part in many aspects of Roman culture, including religion. For example, they frequently fused local Latin deities with Greek pantheon gods. As I was talking about earlier, that's religious syncretism, blending things. Roman homes had an altar for the local divinities, but the family also went to temples and state celebrations and carried out under the auspices of the chief priest or Pontifex Maximus. So it's like a priest in the Roman religion. Oftentimes, if you have had success or something, you would offer games and sacrifices if you could afford it on behalf of the gods that you felt like you honored and worshipped. The Romans required everyone to practice the state religion. However, like the Persians, they tolerated the practice of additional religions as well. Romans were very polytheistic. Eventually, emperors after Augustus required Romans to worship them. Some Romans joined mystery cults like the Eleusinian and the cult of Isis. The cult of Isis is probably the most famous one from Egypt. And now with Judaism and so forth that emerged at this time, starting in the late 60s CE, Jews rebelled against Rome. They kept anticipating the Jewish Messiah coming back. And Christians are going to view that Messiah as Jesus of Nazareth. But there's a really nasty Jewish revolt. I mean, and it was nasty. The Romans eventually crushed it and put it down. But man, it was bad with the capital B-A-D. There's a big siege over the city of Jerusalem, and the slaughter is terrible. A lot of people are starved and resort to cannibalism. There's a big Jewish fortress up high up in a mountain that the Romans built these like siege works to get up there. And it's pretty impressive militarily. They were definitely determined to defeat the Jews. And so they defeat the Jews, and then later in the 2nd century CE, there's another Jewish revolt. And at this point, Rome disperses all of the Jews out of Palestine throughout the empire, and this is what's called the Jewish diaspora. And they don't really come back to Israel in large numbers until the early 20th century. They do destroy the Jewish temple, though, with the first revolt in around 70 CE. Now let's look at Christianity. Christianity is one of the, we've already covered Zoroastrianism and Judaism, and we've talked about the early forms of Hinduism and so forth. I've already introduced Buddhism and so forth. But now let's look at Christianity coming into the picture during that. And so I usually give my students a chart on world religions, and as I cover them, they fill them out. So that world religions recorded lecture, if I gave you that chart, you could fill it out. So if you just take notes from it, that's all you'd be doing. You don't have to necessarily have a chart. So let's look at Christianity. Into the Jewish community emerged the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, who is almost always in historians' top 5 or top 3 most influential people in world history. He challenged traditional religious leaders and was regarded as a troublemaker by Roman officials. Followers of Jesus spread his teachings throughout the Roman world. By the end of the 1st century CE, Christianity was emerging as a distinct form of Judaism. It was on its way to become a separate religion altogether. Early on, the Romans viewed it as just another Jewish sect. Christianity was most popular among the urban poor, slaves, and women throughout the empire because it made everybody equal. Anybody could achieve salvation in Christianity. And it really elevates the status of particularly slave women who were very much abused at this time. And so what also you see is the intellectual, political, and religious ferment of the 1st century CE was fertile ground for Christian teachings. And eventually, over time, as it spreads on trade routes through missionary efforts and trade. Similar to how Buddhism spreads, it spreads through missionary efforts and trade. It's eventually going to appeal to the middle class and upper classes as well. Now, let's look at Peter and Paul. One of the people particularly important in spreading the ideas of Jesus and shaping Christianity was Peter, who was executed in 64 CE, estimated. We're not exactly sure of the exact year he or Paul of Tarsus was killed. But he knew Jesus as one of his first followers. Peter is considered by the Catholic Church as the first pope, but eventually came to Rome, and he was somebody who they think was crucified upside down because it didn't want to be crucified right side up like Jesus of Nazareth, his who he viewed as the Son of God. So, but Peter did spread it. The one who really spreads Christianity even more so is Paul of Tarsus. Paul of Tarsus was a Hellenized Jew, where Peter was a Jew but not Hellenized. So what basically means is Paul is more educated. He's more cultured. As a tent maker, he could travel and find work easier, where Peter was a fisherman, so he was kind of tied to the coast if he's going to make a living as he spreads the religion of Christianity. Paul was originally persecuted Christianity very extensively, and then had a radical conversion experience, and ends up becoming the biggest proponent of Christianity. In fact, early Christians are distrustful of him because of his persecution of the religion. But he ends up getting attacked by Jewish religious authorities as a heretic. He ends up getting imprisoned by Rome. Potentially could have been freed, but appeals his case to Caesar, and one of the provincial governors actually sends him to Rome, where he appears before Nero. I'm not sure how many times, but most likely he is beheaded in the mid-60s CE. But he was big and important in creating Christian churches at Ephesus and Corinth and other places. It's possible he traveled as far west as Spain. We just don't have historical record. He was planning on it, but we just don't have proof that he actually did or not. We do know that Christianity spreads there. Now, one trait of early Christianity was a focusing on living simple lives and isolated from society and so forth. Now, if you look right here at this map, this is where Christianity comes out of Jerusalem and Caesarea area down here. And then it spreads on these trade routes on the Mediterranean Sea trade up to here to Asia Minor and so forth. But over time, it spreads across North Africa. It goes to Spain. It goes east. We do know that there was some form of Christianity that spread east because one of Chinggis Khan's wives in the 1200s was Christian. It's commonly thought that one of the disciples, Thomas, went to Asia, to the Far East and so forth. Well, actually, no, Thomas went to India, they think. There was one of the other disciples, they think, went up to Central Asia and so forth. But it goes to Egypt, and Egypt was one of the early places that had large amounts of converts to Christianity. And this is a mosaic of the Apostle Paul. And you can see where it spreads later after the first century. It spreads widely across the Roman Empire. It doesn't go across the Saharan desert like Islam will later in period 3 through trade, but it does spread this way. And it spreads through trade and missionary efforts. Okay. Now, one of the things that you'll see is with Christians focus on still living simple lives, and sometimes we're isolated from society and sometimes very much a part of society. This allowed members to concentrate on worship and reflection. Over time, some of these people joined together to form monasteries, which are buildings or collections of buildings where people devote their lives to the practice of religion. Later, you're going to see Buddhist monasteries, and you're also going to see Islamic madrasas that are similar. And a second trait was martyrdom. Rome persecuted at times, the living crap out of Christianity. In fact, I wrote a paper in graduate school on martyrdom in the first century, and it is bad. Diocletian actually persecutes it probably the worst, but in the first century, you had Nero set the city of Rome ablaze to help, because he wanted to rebuild part of it for this massive palace complex, and blamed it on the Christians. And so they crucified Christians and lit them on fire to light the way into Rome for several days. They were thrown into the Colosseums or different arenas around the Roman Empire, where they were fed to wild animals and so forth. They were slaughtered in public, and sometimes they were skinned alive. There was one in particular that I thought was fascinating in Egypt, who one of the Roman soldiers poured boiling pitch on this Christian, and it suffocated, and he burned and died. agonizing death. And that person was so moved by their religious devotion into becoming a Christian himself, and then met the same fate the next day. So it depends on where you were in the Roman Empire, where you faced persecution. There was times it was worse than others. There's certain places of the Roman Empire that are worse than others, and there's other places that aren't as bad. It just kind of depends on where you were. Particularly, they didn't like that Christians wouldn't worship the emperor. Okay, and so despite the persecution, Christianity grew stronger. And in 313 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine declared the religion to be legal in the Edict of Milan, which is a big deal. Constantine became the first Christian emperor, although he wasn't baptized at the end of his life, and it was kind of iffy on how Christian he actually was. But he does get baptized at the end of his life. In 330 CE, he moved the seat of the government to Constantinople. And what Constantinople is Byzantium, very important trade city, and he renames it Constantinople after himself. What a humble guy. But it connects the Black Sea with the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. It's one of the most important trade cities of world history. It is the end of the Silk Road in the west. Of course, begins over at Chang in China in the Han Dynasty. It is also where you have goods coming up from the Arabian Peninsula, from the Indian Ocean trade, or coming through the Red Sea trade. Also, a lot of goods coming from the Black Sea trade and Mediterranean Sea trade. So location is key. Now, under subsequent Roman emperors, the Christian religion became the official religion of the empire. The third trait of early Christianity was the appearance of written accounts about the development of the religion, which are found in the first 4 books of the New Testament, found in the Bible. They are known as the Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They also included several letters written mostly by Paul to early fellowships, advising the members and commenting on the teachings of Jesus. Okay. So sorry, I should have put this up earlier when I was talking about Peter and Paul, if you want to take notes on this. So forth. Now, so make sure that you know that it came out of Judaism. Okay, so it breaks out of Judaism and so forth. That's a big one. Now, St. Augustine and so forth, that was kind of one of an influential Christian theologians. So a person who writes about the religion. He was called St. Augustine of Hippo because he was from Hippo, North Africa. He wrote the book City of God, just as Rome was being invaded by what they call the barbarians, but basically just Germanic tribes. He wrote that even if Rome would fall, the city of God and heaven would remain. Tensions that would later culminate in the separation of church and state are also present in his work. And here is a painting of St. Augustine of Hippo. Now let's look at trans-regional trade networks. Christians also brought their religion to Mesopotamia, Persia, and India, and even into Central Asia by way of trade routes connecting communities in Europe and Asia called the Silk Roads. And we'll cover the Silk Roads in another recorded lecture. But the overland roads were trans-regional, in which that they connected regions of various civilizations over long distances. They took different routes depending upon the climate, the friendliness of the territories being crossed, and the number of bandit attacks in a given period. Most of the traders took routes through Central Asian cities such as Samarkand and Tashkent, and these are very important trade cities along the Silk Road. Some went through Indian cities such as Pataliputra into the city of Kathmandu in Nepal. Traders often paid a portion of their goods as tribute to local lords to allow safe passage through their territories. The reason why people made this treacherous journey: money, money, money. There was a lot of money made to be trading on luxury goods on the Silk Road. Overland trade routes from China separated at the desert town of Dunhuang, one going north, one straight west, and one to the south. These routes overland generally converged at Constantinople, and from these goods went to Rome either overland or by sea. So that's very important. And so that's why Constantinople is all about location, location, location. On the Silk Road, you primarily used horses, camels, donkeys. At times they pulled carts, but not always. Usually, probably not. Usually carried them on the backs of horses, camels, or donkeys, and so forth. But they did have an improved saddle that allowed things later on the Trans-Saharan trade route. You're going to have improved camel saddle, allows you to drape bags down the sides of the camel a lot easier. Now, let's look at sea routes. Rome also conducted extensive trade to the east across water. Maritime commerce continued across the Indian Ocean as monsoons permitted. Now, oftentimes Romans didn't make it all the way to Vietnam, but they traded indirectly through the Arabs and Indians with Vietnam. And oftentimes through the Red Sea trade, you would trade with Eastern Africa. Goods at least reached the port of Rome at Ostia. Although pirates were a constant problem, the waters of the Mediterranean were more easily navigated than those of an ocean because of smaller distances and numerous island stopping places. The Romans lacked sophisticated navigational equipment, but they still made truly amazing trips as far north as islands south of Wales. Okay. Now, a major advancement that made its way west from Central Asia was the stirrup for mounted warriors. That's going to lead to the Huns being successful militarily, that among many things. Other goods, silks and spices, and especially gold, were much prized by the upper classes of the Roman Empire. But what you're going to see, though, is you're going to see a trade imbalance. Rome is going to send so much of its coins east, and China had a trade advantage, and that's going to hurt Rome long term. Now, not only did China grow wealthy from trade with Rome, but they traded indirectly, but other cities along the Silk Roads and increasingly on the trans-Saharan routes across northern Africa also benefited from that trade. New fruits and vegetables were introduced to Europe thanks to trade with Asia. Now, let's look at the decline of the empire. From its peak in size and strength, Rome began to slow, uneven decline that began after the 3rd century CE. The population began to decline due to epidemics. Now, there's one thing that you'll see that will be in common between the fall of Han China and the fall of Rome. I used to every year make my AP World History students, their first essay was comparing Rome and Han China, because you had some clear similarities and some clear differences. Now, in terms of their fall, they had similarities. They both were plagued with epidemics like the bubonic plague, influenza, other ailments. Both Rome and Han China had that. They both had economic problems. They both suffered from government corruption. They both struggled with invaders. Now, the Romans dealt with the Huns and the Germanic tribes. China dealt with people of the Central Asian steppes. They were like the Huns, and sometimes they actually were the Huns. Han China falls much sooner. Both of them were very innovative. Rome was very innovative with building and aqueducts and arches and their incredible like Pantheon and developing concrete and the road system and so forth, military technology. Han China, though, was innovative as well with the improved horse collar, this new yoke that didn't choke the oxen as much. Later developing the crossbow, the water-powered mill, among other things that made China very innovative, and so forth. But they definitely had some differences as well. And I'll try to highlight a couple of those as I was talking about this today. But as you read chapter 7 in your textbook, look at the differences and similarities between Rome and Han China, because they're great civilizations to look at. They're relatively about the same time. Rome lasted longer, but Han China was still very much important and very successful. And so you also had pandemics for both of them, such as smallpox. Smallpox, one of the biggest civilization killers. Measles. In fact, epidemics killed as many as 1/4 of the population in some cities. And one thing I learned in grad school is that Christians even stayed behind to take care of these people, and when the plagues hit, and a lot of times died themselves. Diseases spread again in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and yet again in the 6th century. With the decline in population came a decline in trade. That always is going to happen in world history, because you don't have as many consumers who are demanding things. This led to slower economic activity and fewer taxes for the Roman state. As tax revenues dipped, Roman roads and aqueducts were not repaired as often, and armies were not paid as regularly. If you're not getting paid, you're not going to be fighting very loyally. Armies mutinied and trading became less safe, which continued the downward spiral of the empire's wealth and power. They also encountered environmental problems with deforestation to soil erosion. Now, let's look at who's attacking. Okay. And so this is the division of the Roman Empire that happens and so forth under Diocletian. And this is a bust of Constantine, who passed the edict to Milan. Now, Diocletian initially probably persecuted Christianity, probably the worst of any Roman emperor, but then later lets up on that. Constantine is kind of interesting. He kind of, in some ways, used Christianity for his own personal gain, but before he was going into battle in a civil war, because there's called the crisis of the 3rd century, where all this crazy havoc is happening in Rome, and you have powerful emperors of Diocletian and Constantine who keep the empire going longer, otherwise it would have died much sooner. But he was fighting in a civil war against another Roman commander and supposedly saw a cross in the sky. And so he put had all of his soldiers put crosses on their shields, and he was victorious. And so he gave Christian God credit for it, and led him to be a little more sympathetic to them. At least that's how the story goes, and so forth. But he did actually have them paint crosses and so forth. And whether he was an actual Christian or not is kind of for debate. But this is a picture of Constantinople. Or actually, it's Istanbul today. I have a good friend of mine who lived there for 6 months at one point. And so let's look at the challenges from the non-Romans. The growth of the empire results in a larger area to defend. And one of the most famous people who attacked Rome was Attila the Hun. He came from the east, people of Central Asia. They pushed other people groups who would normally assimilate into Rome, such as the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks, further west. It became too much for Roman soldiers to handle this. And the Visigoths even sacked Rome. A lot of the Germanic tribes were recruited in Roman legions, and some of their generals became Germanic, and so they were loyal to the Germanic leader rather than Rome itself. And so Rome was sacked in 410 CE by a Visigoth, and so forth. And then the last Roman emperor was replaced by a Germanic ruler, Odovacer, in 476. Now, Attila the Hun is stopped. In fact, the Pope actually went out and met with him, but nonetheless, it's just a matter of time before the Goths actually take them. Now, the Vandals went through Spain and conquered North Africa. The Franks come into present-day France, hence France. Some of the Saxons of Germany, hence Saxony, eventually invade the British Isles and will later kind of overrun it and so forth. The Visigoths end up bringing it down. What's interesting is that Odovacer replaces the last Roman emperor in 476, but some of the provinces kind of continued on for a few years, so eventually they quit getting paid, and then it ends. But the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine, which we'll cover in Chapter 8 of the History of World Societies textbook, we'll cover that a little bit more in depth. I'm going to cover it briefly here in just a second. This is a painting of the Huns, very, very talented warriors. And this is where the Huns come from. They come out of Mongolia. So they're basically a precursor to the Mongols and Genghis Khan. There's a whole bunch of different tribes in Central Asia. So it's hard to, there's various Mongol tribes. There's various Turkic tribes in Central Asia and so forth. You have the Jurchens, you have the Mongols and others. But they end up settling in Hungary. That's why it's called that. And that's why the people of Hungary are Magyar descent. Rather than Slavic. And that goes way back when. They supposedly the White Huns invaded and took out the Mauryan dynasty, Mauryan Empire. And so this is the farthest extent that Attila the Hun went and so forth. And this is his routes. He did try to, he wanted Constantinople so bad because it was so wealthy, but he couldn't take it. It's one of the most impenetrable cities of world history. It's not until the Ottomans use firearms, and the Greeks lose their recipe for what's called Greek fire that the Ottomans can take Constantinople in 1453. But they darn well try for a while. So this is the Hun Empire. You can see, where the Ostrogoths came from, the Franks, the Saxons. The Saxons eventually come over here. Visigoths, they eventually moved down in here. The Vandals come across North Africa, and Vandals were able to get away with stuff in North Africa because the Western Roman Empire was preoccupied with the Huns. If it wasn't for that, they might have been able to defeat the Vandals, but that's not the case. And so I found a couple of these. These are kind of interesting because China was also fighting the Huns. And Romans viewed them as barbarian. He's kind of like, almost got like devil horns coming out and so forth. And this is the barbarian invasions. And you can see right here some of their maps where the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, the Vandals, all of them moved, the Franks, Lombards, all because of the Huns. The Huns create a domino effect that leads to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, this is one of the most famous Roman aqueducts in France. Beautiful. And you still can use it today. It's incredible. There's the Colosseum. Although the chariot arena, this is the interior of the Colosseum, they could actually fill it up with water and have mock naval battles in there. This is a Circus Maximus, actually a bigger deal for them, but in movies, we think of this. One of my favorite scenes is American tanks driving by this as they go into Rome in June of 1944 during World War II after we are successful um, amphibious assault on Italy against the German and Italian forces. And I want to show you this. This is one of the great architectural achievements of world history. This is from the Byzantine Empire, um, built by the Emperor Justinian. And so that continues on. He builds this in the 500s CE, so right before period 3 begins. And the Byzantine Empire makes another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And its height was under the Emperor Justinian. And he actually recaptured parts of Italy in the process. But we'll cover that in chapter 8. You can see in the green over here to the right. The Parthian Empire was overthrown in the 200s CE by the Sassanids and became the last Persian dynasty. And they fight them, the Byzantines. That becomes their arch nemesis. And we'll cover that in chapter 8 as well. But man, they had some nasty conflict with the Sassanids. Here's where the Visigoths settled. The Franks become France, the Vandals. Later, the Arabs are going to come out of here and conquer the remaining Vandal kingdom. Or the Berbers, or what was left, remnants of the Vandals. And this is the Emperor Justinian. Let's look at the legacy of Rome. This is the last thing we cover. The decline of the Roman Empire did not mean the end of their influence. It's still their influence of American government today. The empire divided into 2 parts under Diocletian, with Rome remaining the capital of the western portion and Byzantium remaining the capital of the east, or Constantinople. The Eastern Persian flourished for many centuries because of its wealth and its location and trade on the Mediterranean Sea trade, the Silk Road, and part of the Indian Ocean connecting to the Arabian Peninsula. Like I said, Roman government influenced the U.S. Constitution. Architecture, domes, paved roads, Roman columns, temples, and amphitheaters were invented by the Romans, and we see a lot of this implemented today in society. Aqueducts are still scattered throughout southern Europe. Roman armies were efficient and organized, and they served as models for militaries all the way to modern times. Legionnaires were disciplined to fight in small, flexible units, as well as large troops of armored infantry. In fact, the French call their elite soldiers the legionnaires. Army engineers developed extensive catapults, devices used to hurl stones at great distance, and siege devices such as the battering rams, along with bridges and military camps that were laid out efficiently and established with great speed. Poets, playwrights, historians, and philosophers from classical Rome are still read today. And then last, and maybe most importantly, the Latin language provided the basis for the family of the European languages called the Romance languages, which include Italian, Romanian, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. English traces about half of its words from Latin, and then the rest are Germanic. Similarly, the legacies of 2 other classical empires in Asia have left powerful legacies, Han China and the Gupta Empire as well. So Han China had a lasting impact on Chinese history, as we'll cover with the civil service exams, the Mandate of Heaven, and their development of luxury goods, their innovations, and so forth. The Gupta Empire will have a lasting impact on Indian history as well.